quorum call be dispensed with?
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to speak briefly about the fiscal year 2012 National Defense Authorization Act. As a member of the Committee on Armed Services and as the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Airland, I can say that it's one of the most, if not the most, bipartisan committees in the Senate. As I've said many times before, Mr. President, we're Americans first. And it's fitting that the Senate still works that way when it comes to providing the tools and resources for our men and women serving in uniform. We recently proved it when we passed the tax credit for unemployed veterans, something I was proud to sponsor and was also proud to be at the White House for the signing ceremony just a little over a week ago. I'm proud of this bill as well, which represents a year's worth of hard work and devotion by Senators Levin and McCain and all the committee members and their staffs for their dedication to putting out a top-notch bill. I want to also thank Senator Lieberman, Chairman of the Airland Subcommittee, for his committed leadership and effort on behalf of our military and military families. I've been honored to work with him and his staff throughout the year. I believe we've developed thoughtful and informed provisions in our subcommittee, Mark, which will authorize funding for our military's most crucial capabilities and resources. Our decisions were informed by a series of hearings that addressed several critical issues facing our air and ground forces, including force structure, modernization of ground forces, tactical aviation, and specifically the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program. In the end, I believe we achieved our goal of executing the Secretary of Defense's vision to enhance our nation's capability to fight the wars we are in today and to address the scenarios we're most likely to face in the future. We're hedging against other risks and contingencies also. I'm also very proud that this bill includes an important provision based on legislation that I introduced with Senator Kelly Ayotte last February, which is No Contracting with the Enemy Act. Mr. President, I had an opportunity to go into Kodal to Pakistan, Afghanistan, and met with a lot of the leaders over there, then General Petraeus and others, and had an opportunity to go back as a soldier recently, still serving, and in speaking with General Allen and a lot of the contracting generals, this by far is the most important piece of legislation we can file when it comes to dealing with funding. And after speaking with obviously General Petraeus and General Allen and all those generals in charge of contracting, I was shocked that we are unable to actually sever contracts once we determine through the new way of paying versus cash versus electronic transfers, that we're actually in some instances doing contracting with the enemy, which in turn are using those funds against our soldiers. And we have heard many stories of those funds falling into Taliban hands and other insurgents' hands and used against us. And that, quite frankly, is unacceptable. Can you imagine that our own troops would be forced to continue giving money to the enemy because they're unable to terminate a contract? I mean, that makes absolutely no sense. So I was very thankful that the committee chairs recognized and ranking members recognized that this is a critical part of the warfighting effort. And as you can imagine, others, I noted, have found it to be unacceptable as well. So I want to thank Senator Ayotte with her leadership, and obviously we can fight this disgusting practice and give our troops the power to void any contracts when it's discovered that the contract benefits enemies of the United States. As General Petraeus stated last year, if money is ammunition, we need to make sure it gets into the right hands, and I couldn't agree with that statement more. The committee had to make some tough decisions in light of the very real fiscal realities we're facing today. And it's no secret that our military is already shouldering a burden unlike in years past, not only at home but also abroad. In today's fiscal environment in which it's very tough to get any dollars, our men and women in uniform stood up and stand up and have identified efficiencies and savings, and they should be commended. And so I want to do that right now. I just want to say, Mr. President, that any consideration of future cuts that place our nation's military's readiness in jeopardy should receive very serious scrutiny. Lastly, Mr. President, I want to say that when the time comes, I look forward to supporting and debating the amendment offered by the senators from South Carolina and Vermont, Graham and Leahy, along with almost 70 other senators who support this amendment. This would give the Chief of the National Guard Bureau a seat at the table of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This could not be more overdue. I think that we all can agree that over the past decade, the Guard, the National Guard has experienced momentous change in the way it fights, in the way it trains, in the way it equips itself. They're serving alongside their brothers and sisters in arms and deserve the same respect with the Joint Chiefs. As a result, the Guard today is much different than the Guard I grew up with when I joined back in 1979. No longer is the Guard considered a strategic reserve used to address limited unforeseen emergencies, but rather today's Guard serves alongside its active duty counterparts in Iraq, Afghanistan, Haiti, and many other strategic locations throughout the world. It serves as the tip of the spear for homeland defense, response, and disaster relief. They're fighting in many areas, obviously overseas, and they're coming home with devastating injuries, just like everybody else. Their families are going through the trauma just like everybody else, and they fought and died in the war on terror. And they represent thousands of American communities across this great country, Mr. President. So I look forward to supporting this amendment when it comes forth. That said, now that the bill is before the full Senate, I hope that we'll have an opportunity to conduct meaningful debates, not be shutting off debate, not doing cloture before it's time, but allowing us to work like we did recently when we passed the 3% withholding, a bill I sponsored, and also the Veterans Hire a Hero Veterans Act, which I also sponsored. Those passed, as you remember, overwhelmingly, with I don't think any dissenting votes. So I, like my colleagues, have offered several amendments which I feel are relevant to protecting and providing the tools and resources for our men and women that are serving. And I look forward to working with the chairman and ranking member to have them considered appropriately. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. President.
I thank the President and yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see.
Mr. President.
I yield the floor, Mr. President.
The Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today in support of the Leahy-Graham amendment that hopefully we'll vote on here soon, hopefully soon. The amendment is pretty simple. It says that the Congress has decided in its wisdom to make the Chief of the National Guard Bureau a member of the Joint Staff. In 1947, we reorganized our Defense Department and created the modern Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs with a chairman, which will provide military advice to the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States. The chairman is the person responsible for advising the President. But the Joint Chiefs are made up of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and with this legislation, the Chief of the National Guard Bureau will become a member. Nothing more, nothing less. It doesn't provide any power to the Chief of the National Guard Bureau in terms of commanding troops. It doesn't interfere in the relationship between the active forces, the Guard, or the reserves. It simply states that now is the time for the National Guard, the citizen soldier, to have a voice on the Joint Chiefs. And the reason I believe it's important, after 9/11, everything about the National Guard and our country's needs has changed. The National Guard is the frontline soldier, airman, when it comes to natural disasters. When our homeland is hit by a natural disaster, they can be called up federally or at the state level to provide assistance to our citizens. And we've seen the effects of natural disasters. It can be a lot of loss of life and property. That's a unique duty. In the last hurricane that came through in the Northeast, the Chief of the National Guard Bureau said that no one from the White House called him other than mid-level operative, and he never really interacted with the Joint Chiefs at all about the needs and capability of the Guard. General Dempsey, the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs, has invited General McKinley, the Chief of the National Guard Bureau, to be an ad hoc member. That's great. But I asked him if somehow he fell out of favor, could you kick him out of the room? And the answer is yes. And I think the Congress needs to make a decision here about the role of the citizen soldier. If you believe, as I do, they're indispensable to fighting the war on terror, they have some leading missions when it comes to Homeland Security post 9/11, that their voice needs to be heard. the active duty forces needs to have the Chief of the National Guard Bureau in that room, advising them about the capability and readiness of the National Guard, their dual status capabilities, what they can do at the state level and the federal level. And I guess I can boil it down to this. To me, it was a national shame and disgrace to deploy National Guard troops after 9/11 without adequate body armor or equipment. And this will make it very hard for that to happen again, because the Chief of the National Guard Bureau will be in the room with his counterparts talking about the needs of this force. And hopefully the coordination and collaboration through this new change will allow the force to be ready, deployable, and we'll never go back to that time period in our history where the Guard and Reserve was called up without adequate equipment, body armor, ready to go to war. This is a change that I think makes sense post 9/11. It doesn't interfere with the day-to-day operations of the military, doesn't confer any power on the National Guard they don't already have. It's just one more voice at a table at a time when I think that voice needs to be heard. The world has changed. Our nation's defense needs have changed post 9/11, and we have 67 co-sponsors. And I'm very proud of the fact that this is one of the most bipartisan piece of legislation I've ever been involved with. Senator Leahy has been a great partner, my co-chairman of the Guard Caucus, and I look forward to having a vote. Senator McCain and Levin have done a great job managing this bill. If you've got amendments, please work with these two gentlemen. We don't want this Congress to go down in history as being the first Congress in 51 years that could not pass a defense authorization bill. We've got enough things going against us already as a Congress. We don't want to add that to the list. So Senator Leahy and myself are willing to do this by voice vote, whatever the body would like. Senator Reid, my good friend from Rhode Island, has a second-degree amendment that basically takes our legislation and defeats the purpose of it. Senator Webb has a second-degree amendment that would substitute a membership and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs with a reporting requirement that just, quite frankly, misses the mark. Both fine men. Senator Webb, who argued years ago that the Marine Corps needs to be a member of the Joint Chiefs, and everybody thought the Navy would have 2 votes, and they fought passionately against it. And it's worked out pretty well. So all the problems with making the Marine Corps a member of the Joint Chiefs haven't panned out. Goldwater Nichols was fought by everybody except the chairman of the Joint Chiefs when it was first introduced. So change comes hard to the Pentagon. This is a change that I think makes common sense. And I would say after 9/11, our citizen soldier deserves this recognition. This would be a great step forward in making sure they're integrated and they never go to war again unless they're really prepared to go. And having that voice day in, day out in the tank, I think will do everybody a lot of good. So I just hope we can vote on this soon. I appreciate Senator McCain and Levin's leadership on this bill. I think we've got a good bill for our men and women in uniform. And I look forward to bringing this up to the floor for a vote. And to my colleagues who want to amend the bill, I appreciate the differences we have, but I think the time has come for the National Guard to be a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff with a full voice, an ability to be heard like they've never been heard before. And the reason they need to be heard, unlike any other time, is that we depend on them, unlike any other time, except maybe the first engagement. When you look who's been around the longest, the first shot fired in creating this nation was fired by the citizen soldier. 200-something years later, let's make sure that they're integrated into our defense infrastructure at the highest levels, because their voice needs to be heard. With that, I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
I ask that the following quorum be suspended.
Without objection.
I assume, Mr. President,
Under the previous order, Senator, the Senator will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Christopher Droney of Connecticut to be United States Circuit Judge for the Second Circuit.
Under the previous order, there will be 30 minutes for debate, equally divided and controlled in the usual form.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
today we in the Senate will confirm Judge Christopher Droney to be U.S. Circuit Judge, Second Circuit. This will be the fifth nominee of President Obama to be confirmed to this circuit, the Second Circuit. In just 3 years, President Obama has matched the number of President Bush's nominees confirmed to the Second Circuit over his entire 8 years in office. With this vote, the Senate will have confirmed 57 Article III judicial nominees during this Congress. This is a great accomplishment considering only 6 sessions of Congress in the last 30 years have confirmed more judicial nominees. In total, over 71% of President Obama's judicial nominees have been confirmed. The seat to which Judge Droney is nominated has been deemed to be a judicial emergency. This will be the 31st judicial emergency nominee to be confirmed this year. This seat being vacant in July 2009 when Judge Calabrese took senior status. The President first nominated Judge Shockney to this vacancy. Judge Shockney is a sitting United States District Judge in Connecticut. However, after reviewing his record, the Senate determined that Judge Shockney should not be elevated, and his nomination was returned to the White House at the end of the 111th Congress. The President did not renominate Judge Shockney and instead sent us the nomination of the person we're considering today, Judge Droney. I raise this bit of history to remind the Senate and those who watch our proceedings of the importance of the role of advice and consent necessary by the United States Senate for somebody to become a judge. So, we in the Senate, and historically, are not here to simply rubber stamp President's nominees. Even as we give the President's nominees a thorough review, we're doing so in a very reasonable time frame. During President Bush's administration, circuit nominees were forced to wait, on average, 247 days for a hearing. President Obama's circuit court nominees have had their hearing, on average, in just 66 days. The same can be said of President Bush's district court nominees, who waited 120 days compared to only 79 days for President Obama's district court nominees. In addition, we have reported nominees in more timely manner. Circuit court nominees have been reported on average in just 113 days compared to 369 days for President Bush's nominees. President Obama's district court nominees have been reported in just 128 days compared to 148 days for President Bush's nominees. Furthermore, for those who still contend that President Bush's nominees are being treated unfairly, let me point out that we have reported a higher percentage of judicial nominees to the full Senate compared to this point in President Bush's presidency. 76% of President Obama's judicial nominees have been reported to date. At this point in President Bush's presidency, only 71% were reported. Now, having set the record straight on the work in progress of this committee, I would tell my colleagues why they should vote for Judge Droney to be Circuit Judge, Second Circuit. Upon graduation from the University of Connecticut School of Law and that was in 1979, Judge Droney joined the Hartford firm of Day, Berry, and Howard and was responsible for civil matters such as personal injury defense, product liability, antitrust, and corporate disputes. In 1981, Judge Droney joined the law department of Aetna Life and Casualty for a brief period working on investment matters. Following his time at Aetna, he joined the private law firm of Buckley and Santos, which specialized in complex civil and criminal trial work. In 1984, Judge Droney joined the Hartford law firm of Reed and Reed. He became a stockholder and officer in 1987 and was a member of the firm's trial departments for 9 years. As U.S. Attorney for the District of Connecticut from 1993 to 97, Judge Droney personally tried 2 cases, including the prosecution of the leadership of the Ku Klux Klan in Connecticut, and argued 3 appeals in the U.S. Court of Appeals, Second Circuit. President Clinton nominated Judge Droney to be U.S. District Judge for Connecticut. June 5th, 97, the Senate voted 100-0 to confirm his nomination. On September the 11th, 97, as a U.S. District Judge, he has presided over approximately 3,600 cases and over approximately 60 trials. All in all, Judge Droney's legal career includes 14 years in private practice, litigation, 4 years as U.S. Attorney, 14 years as a federal judge. The American Bar Association Standing Committee on the Federal Judiciary has rated Judge Droney with a unanimous, well-qualified rating. I ask my colleagues to support the nomination. I yield the floor.
Senator from Vermont.
President, I appreciate the comments of the senator from Iowa, and I appreciate his help in getting the Droney nomination forward. And I do appreciate his concern in moving these forward. I would note, and as I said, I truly appreciate his help in getting the Droney nomination up here. There are 23 other judicial nominations pending on the floor going back to March of this year. And I would hope that those 23 could also be, as I say, going back to March. We move them quickly through the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they're then cleared by every single member of the Democratic Party. But with 23 sitting on the calendar since March, it would be good if we could finish them up before the end of the year. On another matter, Mr. President, I'm pleased on Wednesday, Senator Crapo and I will introduce the Bipartisan Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, 2011. For almost 18 years, the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, has been the centerpiece of the federal government's commitment to combat domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. I'm honored to lead the effort to see it reauthorized. Since its passage in 1994, no other piece of legislation has done more to stop domestic and sexual violence in our communities. The resources, the training provided by VAWA have changed attitudes toward these reprehensible crimes. They've improved the response of law enforcement and the justice system. They've provided essential services for victims struggling to rebuild their lives. It's a law that has saved countless lives. It's an example of what we can accomplish when we work together. Years ago, when I was a prosecutor in Vermont, I saw firsthand the destruction caused by domestic and sexual violence. And those were the days before VAWA, when too often people would dismiss these serious crimes with a joke. There are few, if any, services for victims. I look around desperately trying to find somewhere to help the victim. There are no services. I have to call on people to volunteer. My wife and I even paid, oftentimes, for the expenses of taking care of victims. And that was the same everywhere around the country. We've come a long way since then. There's much more than we can do. I'd love to be able to say there's no more domestic violence, and we don't need this. But we know that there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of cases that have to be resolved. Over the last few years, the Judiciary Committee has held several hearings on VAWA in anticipation of reauthorization. We've heard from people from all over the country. And they've told us the same thing I hear from service providers and experts and law enforcement officials in Vermont. While we've made great strides in reducing domestic violence and sexual assault, these difficult problems remain. There's more work to be done. And the victim services funded by VAWA play a particularly critical role in these difficult economic times. The economic pressures of a lost job or home can add stress to an already abusive relationship. It can make it harder for victims to rebuild their lives. At the same time, state budget cuts are resulting in fewer available services. Just this summer, Topeka, Kansas, took the drastic, almost unbelievable step of decriminalizing domestic violence because the city did not have the funds needed to prosecute these cases. In other words, no matter how badly somebody is beaten or abused or violated, they say, sorry, we can't prosecute this case. We can't afford to. We have to do better than that. How do you tell battered, bruised, beaten victim, sorry, change the locks on your doors or try not to stay at home because they usually come back and do it again, but there's nothing we can do to help you? I just can't believe this country's come to that. Budgets are tight, but it's unacceptable to turn our backs on these victims. For many, the programs funded through the Violence Against Women Act are nothing short of a lifeline. I mean that, just that, a lifeline, because it has saved lives. The reauthorization bill that Senator Crapo will now introduce on Wednesday will reflect Congress's ongoing commitment to end domestic and sexual violence. It seeks to expand the law's focus on sexual assault to ensure access to services for all victims of domestic and sexual violence, to address the crises of domestic and sexual violence in tribal communities, among other important steps. It also responds to these difficult economic times by consolidating programs, reducing authorization levels, and adding accountability measures to ensure that federal funds are used efficiently and effectively. The Violence Against Women Act has been successful because it has consistently had strong bipartisan support for nearly 2 decades. I'm honored to work now with Senator Crapo to build on that foundation. I hope the senators from both parties will join us to quickly pass this critical reauthorization, provide safety and security for victims across America. All anyone has to do is go and read the transcripts of some of the hearings we've had on this, or people like the distinguished presiding officer or myself or others who served in law enforcement, served as prosecutors. We know it goes way beyond just statistics. These are people who have been violated, who turn to their country, to their government for help, for safety. Don't let the United States Senate say, no, we're going to close the door in your face. President, I yield the floor and suggest, Mr. President, I see the distinguished senior senator from Connecticut, and I will yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Connecticut.
I thank the chair, and I thank my friend and colleague and distinguished chair of the Judiciary Committee for his kindness. Mr. President, it's really, as the Speaker sometimes says in the House, a high honor and great personal privilege, with the emphasis on personal, to come to the floor of the Senate to give my strong support to the nomination of Judge Christopher Droney of West Hartford, Connecticut, to serve as a United States Circuit Judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Mr. President, I say it's a high honor because I have profound confidence based on Judge Droney's service as a private attorney, a U.S. attorney, and now for quite a while as a member of the District Court in Connecticut. I have great confidence that he will make an excellent addition to this very important court, the U.S. Court for the Second Circuit. I say it's a great personal privilege to be able to speak on behalf of his nomination because as the occupant of the chair, my colleague from Connecticut knows well, I have known Chris Droney for a long time now, and he and his brother John have been very good friends of mine, great supporters, great sources of counsel, great friends, both graduates of the College of Holy Cross, and the older brother John, who, as we know, probably has less of a judicial temperament than the younger brother Chris. Fortunately, we're approving Chris here for the court, not John. But John tells me that, having been to Holy Cross, that it's still politically acceptable to note that the graduates of Holy Cross consider themselves crusaders. Both John and Chris Droney have been crusaders for what's right, in the best sense of the word. I value their personal friendship. We've gone through a lot together, not just in politics, but I've seen their families grow. I've gotten to know their families. I know what they're made of. We've gone through the natural life cycle tragedies, losing parents, et cetera, together. Chris Droney is a person of real depth and real ability, and will just make an excellent judge. So I stress the personal part because it adds a dimension that you and I both, Mr. President, have had the opportunity to have, which is beyond the resume of Chris Droney, which I'm going to mention in a moment. There's a person here, and it's a person who exemplifies what we mean when we talk about a judicial temperament, who we know has a great intellect, a tremendous legal acumen, who we know is hardworking, and who we know brings common sense to everything that he has done. I mentioned John Droney just because they go together as brothers, and there's nothing that matters more to John, the older and obviously less attractive of the two, nothing more important to him than to the pride he has in his brother's achievements. So John himself, of course, has been a very successful and distinguished member of the bar in Connecticut. So now let me focus on the younger brother, who is the subject of our consideration today. I mentioned that Judge Droney attended the College of Holy Cross in Massachusetts, from which he graduated magna cum laude in 1976, went on to attend the University of Connecticut Law School, where he was the Notes and Comments editor on the Law Review, earned his J.D. there, Doctor of Jurisprudence in '79. After graduating from law school, he worked in private practice as a litigation associate, handling a range of matters, mostly civil at that point. In 1983, he became a partner at the well-respected law firm of Reed & Riga in Hartford, where he represented clients, again, in a wide range of civil matters, including commercial disputes, personal injury actions, property claims, and intellectual property matters. Judge Droney personally tried cases in the Connecticut Superior Court, the United States District Court in Connecticut, and argued appeals in the Connecticut Appellate and Supreme Courts and in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, the court for which he's being considered today. During this period, Judge Droney, like his brother, was involved in public life in Connecticut and served, in his case, on the Town Council of West Hartford as deputy mayor from 1983 to 1985 and as mayor from 1985 to 1989. In 1993, President Clinton nominated Chris Droney to be the U.S. Attorney for the District of Connecticut, where he served with great distinction and effect until 1997. As U.S. Attorney, he initiated new cooperative law enforcement efforts against gangs, healthcare fraud, and financial fraud, in addition to personally trying some major cases in Connecticut and across New England and successfully arguing cases before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, again the court that he is being considered for today in a vote that will occur shortly. Judge Droney was selected by then Attorney General Janet Reno to serve on the Attorney General's Advisory Committee of U.S. Attorneys, in which he was one of 17 U.S. attorneys selected to assist the Department of Justice on a range of pressing matters. In 1997, after 4 years as U.S. Attorney, Chris Droney was nominated to the District Court in Connecticut by President Clinton, and I might say for the second time was confirmed unanimously by this United States Senate. Since then, as a District Court judge, he's presided over numerous federal, civil, and criminal trials, and I think has consistently demonstrated sound judgment and great legal acumen in his many decisions covering an array of complex and sensitive matters. Judge Droney's career speaks to a profound commitment to the rule of law and the credibility of the legal system. I know there's a tendency to want to find is this judge a liberal? Is he a conservative? Is she a conservative? I don't think you can put a label on Judge Droney. Some might say he's a moderate. Others might say he's an independent. I think he's known as somebody who's fair and will take every case as it comes along and decide it on the merits. So now he has been nominated to serve on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. I want to personally express my thanks first to President Obama for submitting his nomination for this very esteemed court, and secondly to our colleagues on the Judiciary Committee, both of whom have been kind enough to be on the floor and speak on his behalf. Senator Leahy's the chairman of the committee, Senator Grassley, the ranking member. I was particularly grateful for Senator Grassley's comments about Judge Droney's capabilities. This is a good man who believes in the law, is tremendously experienced. Incidentally, he sat as a visiting judge on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals and has actually written, I believe, 5 opinions for the Second Circuit Court of Appeals already. So this is somebody who will hit the ground running with the support of the Senate this afternoon. I repeat what I said at the beginning. It's not only a high honor and one that I don't take lightly, but also a great personal privilege to urge my colleagues to support the nomination of Judge Christopher Droney of Connecticut to be a member of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. I thank the chair and I yield the floor. And I'd suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Chair recognizes the senator from Connecticut.
Thank you. I am honored to rise as the junior senator from Connecticut.
If the senator would withhold for a moment. Before we changed roles, I put the Senate into quorum.
I ask that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection, so
Thank
ordered.
you. Thank you, Mr. President, and I am honored to follow the senior senator from Connecticut, rising now as the junior senator from Connecticut, for the same purpose, to urge my colleagues to approve Christopher Droney as a judge on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. And I want to join in thanking the chairman and ranking member of the Judiciary Committee for bringing this nomination to the floor. And incidentally, I want to join in Senator Leahy's very eloquent remarks on the Violence Against Women Act, which I too will support after it is introduced. The reauthorization is very much needed, and particularly at this point in our history, and I thank him for taking the leadership on this issue as on so many others. And I want to thank the senior senator from Connecticut for championing this nomination, and our colleague, the Majority Leader, Harry Reid, who is extraordinarily insightful and sensitive to the importance of judicial nominations, since he is a lawyer himself and a very skilled and able one, and has supported this nomination. Today is a very meaningful one for me personally, almost a magic and very momentous moment to stand in this historic and hallowed place and participate in the approval of a man whom I have known for more than 30 years to a position of the utmost importance, a position of trust and responsibility as important as any in this land, and a person of supremely well-recognized qualifications and experience for this position. Indeed, his life has been almost a preparation for this chapter in his career. And I am privileged and honored to have been a colleague and friend and professional ally of his for more than 30 years. I've known him since his graduation from law school in 1979. We were in litigation together in private practice. When I was United States Attorney for Connecticut and later Attorney General, we worked together. Indeed, when he was United States Attorney, following my service, we were partners in law enforcement in a number of cases, and I had the direct and immediate experience of seeing many of his prosecutions, his intensity of commitment, not just to a successful investigation and prosecution, but his commitment to justice, to doing justice, which is the highest calling of a prosecutor, indeed of any lawyer. And when he became a judge, I had the honor of appearing before him, presenting witnesses, arguing cases, and to have firsthand experience again with the quality of his professional work. And I have to admit, my office as Attorney General did not win every case. We lost some. But whether we won or lost, we emerged from those experiences with an unqualified respect for the quality of his fact-finding and his scholarship. And again, his commitment to doing justice. He has demonstrated as a district court judge the qualities that I know he will bring to the Court of Appeals: extraordinary scholarship and intellect, and adherence to precedent, careful analysis of the law, a thoughtfulness and responsiveness in the questions that he asks, and an insight into the factual record, as well as the truthfulness of witnesses. He has what I consider to be the most important qualification for any judge, which is a capacity for growth, for learning and listening. He is above all, a good listener, a sensitive and responsive listener. He has indeed the qualities that are exemplified by the man whom he will be replacing, Guido Calabresi, a judge known to the senior senator of Connecticut as well as myself, indeed a teacher of mine when I was at the Yale Law School, and I believe very possibly of the senior senator as well. A person of exquisite sensitivity and sensibility and common sense. Those are the qualities of Christopher Droney: sensibility, sensitivity, and common sense. And he shares with Guido Calabresi the grace of writing and sense of history that are so important to the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit.
Debate time has expired.
And so I am proud to join in supporting this nomination, and I wish him well and ask my colleagues to join in approving him when the vote is taken. Thank you.
The question is on the nomination of Judge Christopher Droney. Is there a sufficient second? It appears to be a sufficient second. And the clerk will now call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal,
Aye.
Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. DeMint, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Bingaman, Blumenthal, Brown of Massachusetts, Coates, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Inouye, Isaacson, Levin, Lieberman, and Webb. No senators voted in the negative. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mrs. Hutchison, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico? Aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett? Aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill? Aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin? Aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte? Aye. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn? Aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham? Aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss? Aye. Ms. Collins? Ms. Collins? Aye. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Pryor? Mr. Pryor? Aye. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall of Colorado? Aye. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee? Aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? Aye. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio? Aye. Mr. Burr? Mr. Burr? Aye. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown of Ohio? Aye. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby? Aye. Mr. Sessions? Mr. Sessions? Aye. Mr. Hoven? Mr. Hoven? Aye. Mr. Casey, Mr. Casey, aye. Ms. Snow, Ms. Snow, aye. Mr. Warner, Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. McCain, Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Wyden, Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Coons, Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Thune, Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Lugar, Mr. Lugar, aye. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Carper, Mr. Carper, aye. Ms. Mikulski, Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Enzi, Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Franken, Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Alexander, Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Nelson, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, aye. Ms. Cantwell, Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Kyle, Mr. Kyle, aye. Mr. Corker, Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Carey, Mr. Carey, aye. Mr. Tester, Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. McConnell, Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Roberts, Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Akaka, Mr. Akaka, aye. Mr. Portman, Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo? Aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? Aye. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray? Aye. Mr. Conrad? Mr. Conrad? Aye. Mr. Durbin? Mr. Durbin? Aye. Mr. Nelson? Mr. Nelson of Florida? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Mr. Baucus? Mr. Baucus? Aye. Mrs. Boxer? Mrs. Boxer? Aye. Mrs. Hagan? Mrs. Hagan? Aye. Mr. Cornyn? Mr. Cornyn? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed of Nevada? Aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Lautenberg, aye. Mr. Johans, aye. Cochran? Mr. Cochran? Aye.